York, this is Democracy Now!
Los jefes políticos de la ultraderecha.
The political leaders of the extreme right, promoters of this adventurous coup, go from embassy to embassy, one embassy to another, fleeing between embassies and subjecting the whole country to this anxiety, to the anguish of uncertainty at the highway in Caracas, circumstances that could have been very serious.
Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro is claiming Tuesday's coup attempt against him has failed, but U.S.-backed opposition leader Juan Guaido is calling for another day of mass protests. The Trump administration's openly backing Guaido's efforts to topple Maduro's government.
This is clearly not a coup. We recognize Juan Guaido as the legitimate interim president of Venezuela. And just as it's not a coup when the President of the United States gives an order to the Department of Defense, it's not a coup for Juan Guaido to try and take command of the Venezuelan military.
We'll speak to Venezuelan historian Miguel Tinker Salas and economist Jeffrey Sachs, who just co-authored a shocking report that estimates 40,000 Venezuelans have died as a result of U.S. sanctions. Then we go to Capitol Hill to speak with Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, who's been the target of a series of right-wing attacks that has led to numerous death threats.
They cannot stand that a refugee, a black woman, an immigrant, a Muslim shows up in Congress thinking she's equal to them.
Omar will join us live. Plus, we'll hear excerpts from Tuesday's rally outside the Capitol when Angela Davis and other prominent African-American women gathered to show support for Congressmember Omar, including her colleagues Rashida Tlaib and Ayanna Pressley. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro says he's defeated a coup attempt launched by opposition leader Juan Guaido, the president of the Venezuelan National Assembly. On Tuesday morning, Guaido appeared in an online video standing among heavily armed soldiers, calling for the military to oust Maduro. But the Venezuelan military appears to have remained largely behind Maduro. During the day, clashes broke out between backers of Guaido and the Venezuelan government. There are reports more than 100 people were injured. On Tuesday night, Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro gave a televised address and denied claims by U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo that he'd prepared to flee the country.
The skirmish in Venezuela has been defeated, and Mr. Trump set off 1,000 expletives and lies. My God, how far are the men in the United States government willing to go?
Maduro and Guaido have both called on supporters to take to the streets today. We'll have more on Venezuela after headlines. In Britain, a judge has sentenced WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange to 50 weeks in jail for skipping bail in 2012 to avoid extradition to Sweden on sexual assault accusations, charges that were eventually dropped. He was afraid he would be extradited then to the United States. Last month, British police forcibly removed Assange from the Ecuadorian embassy, where he'd taken asylum for almost 7 years to fight his possible extradition to the United States. After his arrest, U.S. authorities unsealed an indictment accusing Assange of conspiring with Army whistleblower Chelsea Manning, who leaked a trove of sensitive documents to WikiLeaks, including evidence of U.S. war crimes. A London court set to hear an extradition request by the United States on Thursday. The Washington Post reporting Special Counsel Robert Mueller wrote to Attorney General William Barr in March, complaining Barr misled the American public when he summarized Mueller's report in a 4-page memo sent to Congress. According to the Post, Mueller said Barr's summary, quote, did not fully capture the context, nature, and substance of his work, adding, quote, there is now public confusion about critical aspects of the results of our investigation. This threatens to undermine a central purpose for which the department appointed the special counsel, to assure full public confidence in the outcome of the investigations, Mueller wrote. The revelation appears to directly contradict Barr's sworn testimony to Congress in April, when Barr was questioned by Democrat Chris Van Hollen of the Senate Appropriations Committee.
Did Bob Mueller support your conclusion?
I don't know whether Bob Mueller supported my conclusion.
Democrats are demanding an immediate investigation into whether Attorney General Barr deliberately sought to mislead the public over Mueller's findings. On Capitol Hill, a 35-year-old lawyer and activist who's dying of terminal ALS testified Tuesday in an historic first-of-its-kind congressional hearing on Medicare for All. Adi Barkan spoke to the House Rules Committee using a computerized system that tracks his eye movements and turns them into spoken words. In this emotional testimony, Barkan described how, even with a comparatively good health insurance plan, he still pays about $9,000 a month for medical care.
All of us need medical care. And yet in this country, the wealthiest in the history of human civilization, we do not have an effective or fair or rational system for delivering that care. I will not belabor the point, because you and your constituents are well aware of the problems: high costs, bad outcomes, mind-boggling bureaucracy, racial disparities, bankruptcies, geographic inequities, and obscene profiteering. The ugly truth is this: health care is not treated as a human right in the United States of America. This fact is outrageous. And it is far past time that we change it. Say it loud for the people in the back: health care is a human right.
In North Carolina, 2 people were killed and 4 wounded Tuesday when a man with a pistol opened fire at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte, on the last day of classes. The shooting sparked widespread panic across the campus, with students and staff huddling in offices while police locked down buildings for hours. Exams were canceled through Sunday. Police later arrested 22-year-old student Tristan Andrew Terrell, saying the suspect was, quote, not somebody on our radar, unquote. There was no apparent motive for the shooting. According to the Gun Violence Archive, there have been over 100 mass shootings in the United States so far this year. In Minnesota, a jury has found former Minneapolis police officer Mohammed Noor guilty of third-degree murder and manslaughter in the killing of Justine Ruszczyk-Damon, an Australian woman who called 911 to report a possible sexual assault in the alley behind her home. Noor, who was seated in the passenger seat, shot Ruszczyk through the open driver's side window of the vehicle as she approached his police cruiser in her pajamas. This is Justine's father, John Ruszczyk, speaking after the verdict.
Justine was killed by a police officer, an agent of the state. We believe he was properly charged with a crime. The jury has returned a verdict of guilty on murder 3 and manslaughter 2. We are satisfied with the outcome.
The shooting is a rare case in which a black police officer killed a white woman. It sparked widespread protests and the resignation of the Minneapolis police chief. On Capitol Hill, black women leaders gathered Tuesday in defense of Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, one of the first 2 Muslim congresswomen in history and the first member of Congress to wear a hijab. Omar says death threats against her have spiked in number since President Trump tweeted a video juxtaposing her image with footage of the 9/11 attacks. Democracy Now! Was at Tuesday's hands-off Ilhan Omar event. We'll play excerpts from it later in the broadcast and go to Capitol Hill to speak with Congressmember Omar herself. Democratic leaders Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer emerged from closed-door talks with President Trump at the White House Tuesday, saying they've made progress toward a $2 trillion plan to reinvest in U.S. infrastructure. News of the meeting prompted Republican lawmakers to express skepticism. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell rejected calls by Democrats to pay for an infrastructure bill by rolling back Republican tax cuts that overwhelmingly favor the wealthy, calling the proposal a non-starter. And in New York City, police arrested 7 nonviolent protesters Tuesday as they peacefully blocked access to Democratic Senator Chuck Schumer's Manhattan office. The youth activists with the Sunrise Movement are calling on the Senate Minority Leader to endorse the Green New Deal, a resolution calling for a transformation of the U.S. economy by funding renewable energy while ending U.S. carbon dioxide emissions by 2030.
I'm willing to get arrested and put my body on the line for the Green New Deal because it means the bodies of all of the people who are being affected by the climate crisis. We are here demanding that Senator Schumer sign on to a Green New Deal. Stand with us, Chuck Schumer.
Activists with the Sunrise Movement say they've asked Senator Schumer to convene town hall meetings to discuss his climate plan, but say their requests have been rebuffed or ignored. This is Araceli Jimenez, a resident of Brooklyn's Sunset Park neighborhood.
I have lived in Sunset Park since I was 4 years old. It is a low-income, immigrant community of color, and it was ravaged by Hurricane Sandy. So I have seen what the climate crisis is going to do, what it's already doing to communities like mine all across this planet. And when our Senate Minority Leader refuses to co-sponsor the only plan on the table that is going to address the crisis at the scale that science and justice demand, then that is unacceptable. I will not stand for it, and neither should you.
And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro is claiming to have defeated a coup attempt launched by opposition leader Juan Guaido, the president of the Venezuelan National Assembly. On Tuesday morning, Guaido appeared in an online video standing among heavily armed soldiers calling for the military to back what he called the final phase of an effort to topple Maduro's government. Guaido appeared alongside Leopoldo Lopez, a longtime opposition leader who was reportedly released from house arrest by renegade officers. Guaido has been attempting to topple the Venezuelan government since January, when he declared himself to be Venezuela's interim president. The Trump administration, as well as Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro and others, openly supported the coup attempt. Earlier today, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo told Fox Business military action in Venezuela is possible, quote, if that's what's required. On Tuesday, clashes broke out in the streets of Caracas and other cities. There are reports that one person has died and 100 people were injured. On Tuesday night, Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro gave a televised address and denied claims by U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo that he had prepared to flee Venezuela.
Decía Mike Pompeo en la tarde que yo, decía Maduro.
Mike Pompeo said in the afternoon that Maduro had a plane to flee to Cuba and that the Russians got him off the plane and forbade him from leaving the country. Mr. Pompeo, what a lack of sincerity. Mr. Bolton also gave orders to military and civilian personnel in Venezuela to join the coup. The skirmish in Venezuela has been defeated, and Mr. Trump set off 1,000 expletives and lies. My God, how far are the men in the United States government willing to go?
Maduro and Guaido have both called on supporters to take to the streets today. At the United Nations, Venezuela's UN ambassador Samuel Moncada accused the United States and other nations of backing the coup attempt.
This was not a domestic event growing from within. No, this came from abroad. Without the power of the United States, the CIA, with the intelligence apparatus, without the money from the United States, without the economic war, without the government of President Duque in Colombia, this would have been impossible. Without the help of the government of Chile, which gives protection to the leader of the coup, without the help of the Brazilian president, Mr. Bolsonaro, who gives help to the soldiers, this is an international conspiracy.
In Washington, National Security Advisor John Bolton repeated the Trump administration's position on Venezuela, saying all options are on the table. He also insisted Tuesday's events were not a coup.
We want, as our principal objective, the peaceful transfer of power. But I will say again, as the president has said from the outset, and that Nicolas Maduro and those supporting him, particularly those who are not Venezuelan, should know, is all options are on the table. This is clearly not a coup. We recognize Juan Guaido as the legitimate interim president of Venezuela. And just as it's not a coup when the president of the United States gives an order to the Department of Defense, it's not a coup for Juan Guaido to try and take command of the Venezuelan military.
To talk more about the situation, we're joined by two guests. Miguel Tinker Salas is a Venezuelan historian and professor at Pomona College in California, author of The Enduring Legacy, Oil, Culture, and Society in Venezuela, and Venezuela, What Everyone Needs to Know. He's joining us from Claremont, California. And here in New York, Jeffrey Sachs, leading economist and director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University, is with us. He recently co-authored a report for the Center for Economic and Policy Research on the deadly impact of the the U.S. sanctions on Venezuela. The center's estimating more than 40,000 Venezuelans have died since 2017 as a result of the sanctions. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Professor Miguel Tinker-Salas, let's begin with you. What do you understand is happening on the ground right now in Venezuela? What has taken place and the significance of Juan Guaidó standing together with Leopoldo López?
What took place yesterday was an intended coup. The problem is if you're going to stage a coup, you normally would have the generals and the admirals standing at your side. So obviously that didn't happen. So it was an attempt on the part of Guaidó and López and his faction within the right-wing opposition to try to create greater divisions within the military. It was obviously that he did not have that support. What had happened was they had a handful of lower-ranking officers from the National Guard. They had one general from the Military Intelligence Service, but they did not have the core within the Army or the Navy or the Air Force. They tried to leverage that. It failed. It failed miserably. And here we are once again with a crisis scenario in Venezuela. But again, there's two audiences here. One is an audience internal to Venezuela to assure Guaidó's support and consolidate his support within the opposition, which was beginning to seem shaky. And the other is the audience internationally, appealing to Donald Trump, appealing to Pompeo, appealing to Ivan Duque, appealing to Bolsonaro. So there's two audiences that Guaidó was directed at yesterday. The internal one failed. And today we have protests on both sides for March 1st, which again could repeat a cycle of violence. The expectation is that they will be separate marches and hopefully peaceful marches.
I want to turn to Mike Pompeo. This is in an interview with CNN's Wolf Blitzer on Tuesday. Secretary of State Pompeo was asked what the U.S. would do if Maduro arrests Guaidó, and also asked about Russia's role in keeping Maduro in the country.
I'm not going to get into specifics, but we've made very clear we would consider that a major escalation. Wolf, we've watched throughout the day. It's been a long time since anyone has seen Maduro. He had an airplane on the tarmac. He was ready to leave this morning, as we understand it, and the Russians indicated he should stay. We've made clear all along, Wolf, that Maduro is surrounded by Cubans and has been supported by Russians there in Venezuela. And we've told the Russians and we've told the Cubans that's unacceptable.
So that's Mike Pompeo, Miguel Tinker-Salas, saying that Maduro was ready to leave with a plane on the tarmac to fly to Cuba, but got a call from Russia, and so he stayed. Is this fake news?
It's a false flag operation. Why would Maduro want to leave the country when, by all accounts, the so-called coup had already failed? But yes, there is a side note to that, and that is that Guaidó is trying to provoke Maduro, trying to provoke a crisis, because under these conditions, anyone leading a coup committed an illegal act. So what Guaidó would like is Maduro to arrest him, to provoke a crisis, to escalate the scenario, and therefore create the context in which the U.S. can operate either through direct action, through a naval blockade, or through action by the part of Colombia or Brazil. So as I said earlier, this is an effort to provoke this crisis, to try to escalate it, because we've already had 3 separate incidents previously. Guaidó claimed he would be president on January 23rd. He wasn't. It failed. He claimed that on February 23rd, from the border in Cucuta, he would re-enter the country, assume the presidency. It failed. So once again, we have Guaidó claiming that he will assume the presidency. This time it appears to have failed as well. And in fact, there are criticisms within the opposition to his all-or-nothing strategy. And there has to be a reflective period for the opposition to think of what they've done and to really consider the option, again, once again, of negotiations, rather than this idea that through military action they're going to come to power.
Can you talk about where in Caracas this coup attempt took place and who exactly? Go ahead.
The coup took place in the center of Caracas, what's called Eastern Caracas, in the Altamira corridor, the Altamira district, which has been historically the center of the opposition's base in Chacao, in Altamira, in Palos Grandes. And they attempted to move down towards La Carlota, the air base that resides in the middle of Caracas. Some of the military personnel that were present said they were tricked. They were told to show up to receive a medal, to receive a decoration, and they were brought to Guaido's side, again, by a certain number of captains and colonels of the National Guard. That's important because they don't represent the core of the military. There were several lieutenants and several colonels present from intelligence, from the National Guard, but again, not the general staff of the military, not those individuals that command bases, not those individuals that command regiments or battalions, and that was the most important thing. But again, what we saw was a repeat of series of actions that have been led by Guaido and his opposition, trying to topple the government, which for the moment have seemed to fail again, and basically in the core area of support, which is the east part of Caracas.
We're going to break and then come back to our discussion. And in addition to historian Miguel Tinker-Salas, we'll be joined by leading economist Jeffrey Sachs. Stay with us.
El lagrimiar de las cumaraguas está cubriendo toda mi tierra. Piden la vida y le dan un siglo, pero con tal que no pase nada en mi tierra mansa, mi mansa tierra. Yo sé que un día tuviste sueños, no viste un río cuando pequeño, pero tu alma se te alegraba con la llegada del vendaval. Huellas cansadas tienen tus pasos, pero aunque el río sea muy manso, poquito a poco se enfrenta al mar. Cuelga tu canto de turpial, llena de gritos el cardonal. Y hay semerucos allá en el cerro y un canto hermoso para cantar. Que semerucos allá en el cerro y ya la gente empezó.
Gentle Song for a Brave People by the Venezuelan musician Ali Primera. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. Our guests are Miguel Tinker-Salas, a Venezuelan professor at Pomona College in California. Jeffrey Sachs is with us here in New York, leading economist and director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University. He's recently co-authored a report for the Center for Economic and Policy Research, headlined Economic Sanctions as Collective Punishment, the Case of Venezuela. So much is being used against the presidency of Maduro, saying he's brought the country to an economic standstill. You make a different case, Jeffrey Sachs.
Well, it's not an economic standstill. It's a complete economic collapse, a catastrophe in Venezuela. There was a crisis, for sure, before Trump came to office. But the idea of the Trump administration from the start has been to overthrow Maduro. That's not a hypothesis. Trump was very explicit in discussions with presidents of Latin America where he asked them, why shouldn't the U.S. just invade? He said that already in 2017. So the idea of the Trump administration has been to overthrow Maduro from the start. Well, the Latin leaders said, no, it's not a good idea. We don't want military action. So the U.S. government has been trying to strangle the Venezuelan economy. It started with sanctions in 2017 that prevented essentially the country from accessing international capital markets and the oil company from restructuring its loans. That put Venezuela into a hyperinflation. That was the utter collapse. Oil earnings plummeted. The earnings that are used to buy food and medicine collapsed. That's when the social humanitarian crisis went spiraling out of control. And then in this year is with this idea, very naive, very stupid in my view, that there would be this self-proclaimed president, which was all choreographed with the United States very, very closely. Another round of even tighter sanctions, essentially confiscating the earnings and the assets of the Venezuelan government took place. Now Venezuela is in complete, utter catastrophe. A lot of it brought on by the United States deliberately, creating massive, massive suffering. We know there's hunger. We know there's incredible shortage of medical supplies. We can only imagine, because we won't know really until the dust settles and careful studies are done, how much excess mortality there is. But surely in in a context like this, this is a catastrophe largely created by the U.S. because, as was said earlier, this is an all-or-nothing strategy. What Trump just doesn't understand, and what Bolton, of course, never agrees to, is the idea of negotiations. This is an attempt at an overthrow. It's very crude, it's not working, and it's very cruel because it's punishing 30 million people.
How did you come up with the number 40,000 dead as a result of these crippling U.S. sanctions?
Let me be clear. Nobody knows. This was a very basic, simple calculation based on estimates of universities in Venezuela that mortality had increased by a certain proportion after the sanctions. I don't want anyone to think that there's precision in these numbers. What is certain, though, staring us in the face, is that there is a humanitarian catastrophe deliberately caused by the United States by what I would say are illegal sanctions, because they are deliberately trying to bring down a government and trying to create chaos for the purpose of an overthrow of a government.
Why?
Why are they doing that? This is normal U.S. right-wing foreign policy, nothing different. This is the same foreign policy that we saw throughout Latin America in the 20th century. It's the same foreign policy that we saw catastrophically in the Middle East. This is Mr. Bolton. This is Mr. Bolton's idea of diplomacy. This is Trump's idea of diplomacy. You punch someone in the face, you crush your opponent, you try whatever way you can to get your way. It's very simple-minded, it's very crude, and it never works. It just leads to catastrophe.
I want to bring Miguel Tinker-Salas back into this conversation, professor at Pomona College. As these protests were taking place or this coup attempt was taking place in Venezuela, in Honduras, there were massive protests against privatization, also huge demonstrations in Paris. You certainly don't get the same kind of coverage.
No, you don't. And the reality is that what's happening in Honduras is fundamental. You have an effort of privatization. You have layoffs of doctors and of professors and of teachers. And there's massive street protests happening in Tegucigalpa and all the major cities. And the attention is all on Venezuela. At the same thing is happening in other contexts for Central America. The immigration that's happening as a result of failed U.S. policies. As our colleague was saying earlier, the reality is this was tried elsewhere. The regime change that's being tried in Venezuela has been tried elsewhere in Latin America and has led to humanitarian crisis throughout Central America, Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, in Mexico until very recently. So again, we know the formula. We know it doesn't produce the change that most people want. And what it does is it aggravates conditions for the majority of the population. So you have, in the case of Venezuela, mistakes made by the Maduro administration that are now exacerbated by the sanctions and that take a toll on humans and on the population of the country.
We've been showing for our radio audience video, just to let you know, of the tear gassing of people in Paris and Honduras right now. Of course, Honduras is a U.S. ally. We're not getting as much coverage of this. Finally, I wanted to ask Jeffrey Sachs about this issue you raise of collective punishment and saying that collective punishment of a civilian population, as described by both the Geneva and Hague International Conventions, to which the U.S. is a signatory, and that way.
And I would say of the OAS also, which explicitly prohibits this kind of hostile action against another country. U.S. sanctions are now being imposed to bring down governments everywhere. You have similarly in Iran yesterday, big announcement of the collapse of the Iranian economy, and the IMF attributed it to U.S. sanctions. So this is what the Trump administration is trying to do also vis-a-vis Nicaragua. Trump said yesterday, total blockade on Cuba if they don't smart up. This is pure bullying. It is completely against international law. It creates havoc. It's hard enough to achieve economic progress, but when the U.S. is using its political power to break other countries, the results absolutely can be devastating. And we see it in Venezuela that it was the kick that pushed Venezuela into this catastrophic spiraling decline and hyperinflation. It's always blamed in our press on Maduro, but people don't even look and understand how the U.S. has the instruments of sanctions, blocking access to financial markets, pushing enterprises into default, blocking trade, confiscating the assets owned by the Venezuelan government precisely and with the design of creating this kind of crisis, because the idea is if the pain is enough in the thinking of people like Bolton, then there will be a military overthrow. So they're trying to create absolute disaster. Well, what's so stupid about these American policies, these neocon policies, is they do create disaster, but they don't achieve even the political goals of these nasty people like Bolton. It's not as if they're effective and nasty. They're completely ineffective and totally nasty at the same time. But Congress, in our country, nobody looks. It's unbelievable that you have this basically one-man show of Trump doing damage, rampaging around the world. There's no oversight at all. And in the international institutions like the IMF, the Inter-American Development Bank, people are scared to even say the truth that this bully of the United States, especially with the kind of president we have right now, no one wants to speak the obvious facts of how much damage is being done. How many lives are being lost, how much suffering is being created, how many refugees are being created deliberately. And then, of course, you get the New York Times or someone else saying it's Maduro's whatever, because they don't even look at the obvious, the obvious process.
And you have Democratic leaders as well in Congress saying the same thing. And so we're going to turn right now to a Democrat in Congress. We want to thank Jeffrey Sachs, who is a leading economist, director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University. We'll link to your report that you put out with the Center for Economic Policy Research, headlined Economic Sanctions as Collective Punishment, the Case of Venezuela. And Miguel Tinker-Salas, thanks for joining us, professor at Pomona College in California. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. As we turn now to Congressmember Ilhan Omar, a Minnesota Congressmember. She is the first Somali-American elected to Congress, to the House of Representatives, one of the first Muslim women in Congress. In February, Ilhan Omar questioned U.S. Special Envoy to Venezuela, Elliott Abrams, on Capitol Hill. We welcome you to Democracy Now! Congressmember Ilhan Omar, before we talk about the remarkable rally held for you in defense of you yesterday, just outside the Capitol next to the reflecting pool, if you can comment what's taking place right now in Venezuela, the U.S.-supported coup attempt against President Maduro.
Thank you, Amy, for having me. It's really great to join you all this morning. I concur with what Professor Sachs was saying. You know, I mean, a lot of the policies that we have put in place has kind of helped lead the devastation in Venezuela. And we've sort of set the stage for where we are arriving today. This particular bullying and the use of sanctions to eventually intervene and make regime change really does not help the people of countries like Venezuela, and it certainly does not help, and it's not in the interest of the United States. And I think finally we have folks in Congress that see what Professor Sachs was referencing.
I want to turn right now to your questioning, Congressmember Ilhan Omar, your questioning of Elliott Abrams, the man who President Trump has made the special envoy to Venezuela. Elliott Abrams, the person who was convicted of lying to Congress twice. Ultimately, he was pardoned by President George H.W. Bush. But this is Elliott Abrams before you in committee.
In 1991, you pleaded guilty to 2 counts of withholding information from Congress regarding your involvement in the Iran-Contra affair.
for which you were later pardoned by President George H.W. Bush. I fail to understand why members of this committee or the American people should find any testimony that you give today to be truthful.
If I could respond to that.
It wasn't a question.
Congressmember Ilhan Omar, if you can talk about the significance of Elliott Abrams being made the point person on Venezuela and what you do think Congress can do. I mean, congressional leaders, including House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and others, a bipartisan group, are supporting Guaido, the man who simply announced that he's president of Venezuela.
And people like Elliott Abrams, neocons and warmongers, you know, for so long have pushed for policies that are now, we can see not only in Central America, but many parts of the world, the kind of devastations that they've had for decades. I could not pass up the opportunity to not only remind the American people that this was someone who was convicted of lying to Congress, but also someone who had a heavy hand in some of the most devastating policies that we imposed on Central America, and that there is a direct correlation between the kind of mass migration that we're noticing right now from Central America and South America to this country. I think for so long we've used muscle memory to sort of generate our foreign policy, and it's about time, like Professor Sachs said, that we pause and we look at the kind of implications that our policies have, what our ultimate goal is, what is being successful, and what are some policies that we should do away with. I remember talking to Madam Secretary Albright and talking to her about the success of sanctions we imposed around the world and how some of them have devastating effects on the actual population and not on the governments that we see as our adversaries. And she concurred with me that many of the sanctions that we impose ultimately lead to devastations, and we are seeing it now in Venezuela, and ultimately lead to having severe problems in that country, which doesn't stabilize life for the people, and certainly puts us here in the United States at risk.
Congressmember Ilhan Omar, we're going to break and then come back to talk about this unusual rally that was held just outside the Capitol building next to the reflecting pool yesterday. Black women from around the country came in, led by, among others, Angela Davis. You stood with your sister Congress members, Rashida Tlaib, Ayanna Pressley, and people expressed their support for you, deeply concerned about the spike in the number of death threats against you and President Trump's singular attack on you. We're going to go to that in one moment.
We go high when they go low. I know they don't know what they're doing when they tell their lies, spread around rumors. I know they're still human and they need my love. Gonna stand side by side, our hearts in command. Love is our guide. We go high when they go low. I know they don't know what they're doing.
We Go High by Mavis Staples. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. African-American women leaders gathered on Capitol Hill Tuesday in defense of Congressmember Ilhan Omar, one of the first two Muslim congresswomen in history, the first member of Congress to wear a hijab. Omar has been the target of numerous right-wing attacks since taking office, including by President Donald Trump himself. Omar says death threats against her have spiked in number since President Trump tweeted a video juxtaposing her image with footage of the 9/11 attacks. Congresswomen Ayanna Pressley and Rashida Tlaib, civil rights icon Angela Davis, and others addressed the crowd Tuesday to urge Congress to censure President Trump, who they referred to simply as the occupant of the White House, for his attacks on Omar, and to send a message to both political parties, hands off Ilhan Omar. This is Congressmember Ayanna Pressley.
I had to come here to lend my voice in solidarity. Yeah, I happen to be a congresswoman, but before all commas and titles, I'm a black woman. And Ilhan is my sister. I am changing the things I can no longer accept. And from R. Kelly to Donald Trump, what we can no longer accept is the silencing of black women. This is the reckoning. This is us assuming our rightful place as the table shakers, as the truth tellers, as the justice seekers, as the preservers of democracy. We are demanding that you trust black women, that you see black women, that you believe black women, and honor us for the role that we have played as healers and preservers of this democracy and this nation. Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib. You know, I grew up in the most beautiful blackest city in the country, in the city of Detroit. And many of my teachers, my mothers on the block, all of them accepted me as a Palestinian woman, as a woman that understood through the lens of my ancestors, through the lens of my living grandmother in the West Bank and the occupied territories of Palestine. They knew what I meant when I talked about the pain of oppression or the pain of feeling less than. And I remember Ilhan saying that to me once, like, you know, Rashida, I was born in a community where I was the majority. But you were born in a country where you felt like you were second class immediately when you were born, right? And this is a woman that speaks that way, that is raw, that is real. And I cannot stand that they continue to police her. They continue to police our words. They continue to police our positions. But I say hands off. Hands off of the women of color that serve in the United States Congress. Not only do we look differently, but we serve and we fight differently. And it also means that we talk differently. It's also that we are allowed to be angry in this country. Angela Davis.
It is about time that we stepped up to defend those who represent our political vision on the front lines of struggle. I feel particularly motivated to join this amazing group because the attack against Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, while it is clearly directed at her as an individual, is also designed to dissuade all of us from speaking out on issues that are considered controversial. The attacks on her emanating from the occupants' Twitter feed. That's right, the occupants' Twitter feed. And the numerous threats of assassination from white nationalists and their supporters are a way of sending messages to other black women, to all who hold radical and progressive political views, that they too can be made into targets of vitriolic, violent racism. Be quiet, or you will suffer the fate of Ilhan Omar. That is the message. But we do not heed that message. We refuse to be quiet.
Human rights leader, scholar, Professor Angela Davis speaking in defense of Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, who's repeatedly been accused of being anti-Semitic for criticizing the power of AIPAC and the Israeli lobby in Washington and questioning U.S.-Israeli relations. Despite the threat, she's refused to be silent, has continued to speak out against racism, against Islamophobia, against anti-Semitism and right-wing violence. Ilhan Omar, I wanted to ask you about, well, one of the many comments was Tracy Blackman, Reverend Blackman, saying that Islamophobia and anti-Semitism grow from the same tree, that they are different branches of the same hate. Can you talk about this?
Yeah, I mean, I referenced it as being of this, of the two sides of the same bigoted coin. We know that many of the people who are targeting the Jewish community for anti-Semitism are also targeting the Muslim community in Islamophobia. And so we have to collectively work together to uplift our voices and say no to hate. We know that both of our communities here in the United States are targeted by white supremacists. And we know that the conservatives are doing everything that they can to distance themselves, to disinform the public about the monsters that they helped feed that are now causing devastation in mosques and in synagogues. And if we are not collectively wising up to that reality, then we will suffer the pain of it.
President Trump recently said, in speaking to local media, talking about you, she's somebody that doesn't really understand life, real life. She's got a way about her that's very, very bad for our country. If you can respond to this and tell us about your real life, where you were born, what you've survived.
Yeah, I mean, unlike the president, I don't adhere to the belief that we should be furthering xenophobia in this country. This is my country. There is no his America. This is our America. We collectively live in this country, and I have as much of a right to it as he does and anyone else. So that's one. Second, let me just say this. For this president, who really was born with a silver spoon on his mouth, who wrote the backs of marginalized people to make his money, to talk to me as someone who'd survived war, lived in a refugee camp, learned English in 6 months, worked almost every single job that you could imagine, from cleaning offices to being a cashier, to working my way up to now being a member of Congress with only 2 decades of being in this country, to talk to me about real life, really tells you how demented he sounds, and how much he's really willing to go in furthering the demonization and the silencing of minority communities who understand that we have the power as people to stand up to him, to fight for the America we know we deserve, and to practice the kind of political joy that allows for all of us to participate and fight for prosperity, not for the few, but for the many.
Congressmember Ilhan Omar, I know your time is very short, and I wanted to ask, with the media painting you as a one-issue Congress member, what you think is being missed? For example, yesterday, the first ever hearing on Medicare for All, the emotional testimony of the Adi Barkan, who is dying of ALS, and others. If you can talk about Medicare for All, why you've come out in support of it, and also whether you feel that President Trump should be impeached.
Yeah. So Medicare for All and the testimony of Adi, the very impassioned testimony of someone we all love and are really excited that he gets the opportunity. He got the opportunity to speak at the first hearing of a policy that he's been so passionate about, is one that I am really privileged enough to be the vice chair of the Medicare for All caucus. It's important that we recognize healthcare as a human right, and that we make sure that everyone, regardless of their economic status here in this country or their employment status, should have access to healthcare. It's one that I'm very passionate about. I talked about how my aunt at a young age in Somalia died because she didn't have access to insulin to take care of her diabetes. And in Minnesota, we had a very young man around the same age as my aunt, in his early 20s, who died because he could not afford insulin. And so to have something like that happen, not in a country like Somalia, but here in the United States as well, is one that we should be ashamed of, and one that we should work really hard to make sure it doesn't happen again.
Impeachment?
And in the question of impeachment, it's about time. We've had the investigations. Mueller has clearly stated that if he was giving a different opinion by the general attorney, that he would indict. And now he's kicked the ball to Congress, and we have an opportunity now to start impeachment proceedings for events that happened pre-election. And Rashida, myself, Alex, and others are pushing to make sure that we can investigate post-election Trump and many of the obstructions and criminal activities that might have taken place in his White House.
Well, I want to thank you so much for being with us, Congressmember Ilhan Omar, Minnesota Congressmember representing the 5th Congressional District, first Somali American elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, one of the first Muslim women in Congress. I know you have to leave us, but we're going to turn now with your words, the words you shared yesterday at the reflecting pool outside the Capitol, speaking at the rally in your support.
Here's the thing that really offends a lot of people and the reason that we are here. I was born as a very liberated human being to a country that was colonized, that recognized that they can colonize the land, but they can't colonize your mind. To people who recognized that all of us deserve dignity and that no human being was ever going to tell you that you were less than them. Yes. 13 people organized for our independence in Somalia. Wow. So I was born in that breath of recognizing that they might be more powerful than you are, that they might have more technology than you have. Yeah. They might think that they are wiser than you. They might control all of the institutions. But you control your mind, and that is what sets you free. So a sister of mine on TV said, the thing that upsets the occupant of the White House, his goons in the Republican Party, many of our colleagues in the Democratic Party, is that they can't stand, they cannot stand that a refugee, a black woman, an immigrant, a Muslim shows up in Congress thinking she's equal to them. But I say to them, how else did you expect me to show up? I tell people every single day, I have a certificate that everyone else has hanged in their offices in Congress. The same exact certificate of election. But I got more people who voted for me and sent me here than 428 of them. So when they say, who does she think she is? When they say, who does she think she is? I am the one that the people sent to be a voice for them. So we have to always recognize that one marginalized voice represents many marginalized voices. But I don't only represent one marginalized voice. Because in this country, being black is enough of being marginalized. But I also happen to be a woman. That's a second marginalization. I happen to be a Muslim. And I also happen to be a refugee and an immigrant from what they call one of the shithole countries. The reality is that shithole country raised a very proud, dignified person. Our circumstances might not always be perfect, but that doesn't lessen our humanity. And I am not in the business of defending mine. So when this occupant of the White House chooses to attack me, we know that that attack isn't for Ilhan. That attack is the continuation of the attacks that he's leveled against women, against people of color, against immigrants, against refugees, and certainly against Muslims. And we are collectively saying, your vile attacks, your demented views are not welcome here. This is not going to be the country of the xenophobics. This is not going to be the country of white people. This is not going to be the country of the few. This is the country of the many. This is a country that was founded on the history of Native American genocide, on the backs of black slaves, but also by immigrants. And so as much as we need to remedy the history that we continue to neglect, we also must recognize that every liberty that we enjoy here, every single progress we get to celebrate, came about because immigrants participated in it. Yes. So I know my place in this society. All of you know your place in this society. And it's one that is equal to every single person that walks in it.
Minnesota Congressmember Ilhan Omar speaking in front of the Capitol at a protest in her defense organized by black women leaders. Sitting behind her, Angela Davis, Congresswomen Ayanna Pressley and Rashida Tlaib, urging Congress to censure President Trump, who they referred to simply as the occupant of the White House, for his attacks on Omar, and to send a message to both political parties, hands off Ilhan Omar. She says she has suffered a spike in death threats against her since President Trump pinned a tweet of a video that juxtaposed Ilhan Omar against the 9/11 attacks. This does it for our show. Democracy Now! Has an immediate job opening for a paid full-time digital fellowship here in New York City. We also are accepting applications for paid 6-month internships. Learn more at democracynow.org. Democracy Now! Is produced by Mike Burke, Dina Guzder, Nermeen Sheikh, Carla Wills, Tammy Warrenoff, Sam Alkoff, Dennis Moynihan, John Hamilton, Robbie Claren, Hani Massoud, Trina Nadura, Tay Marie Astudio, and Libby Rainey. Mike DeFilippo and Miguel Noguera are engineers. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks for joining.